The dust of the auction house tasted of despair. It coated Alara's tongue, a gritty film that was the flavor of her 16th birthday. She stood on a rough-hewn platform, her thin calico dress a poor defense against the 100 hungry eyes that stripped her bare. Beside her, her brother, Finn, clutched her hand, his small body a single, sustained tremor. He hadn't spoken a word since the fever took their mother, and the silence had become his only shield. Silas Blackwood, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, paced before them, his cane tapping a predatory rhythm on the floorboards. "A fine pair," Blackwood announced, his voice slick with false charm. "Hardy stock. The girl, 16 today, ripe for work in a respectable house. The boy is quiet, won't give you no trouble." A ripple of lewd laughter moved through the assembled crowd of miners, ranchers, and men whose professions had no name.
Elora Flint's head, pulling Finn closer.
She stared at a crack in the floor, focusing on the splintered wood as if it could swallow her whole. The bidding began, a cacophony of gravelly voices tossing out numbers that represented years of her life, of Finn's life. Each bid was a hammer blow against her soul. She felt herself fragmenting, drifting away from the girl on the block, a ghost watching her own desecration. Then the saloon doors swung open, casting a long, imposing shadow that silenced the room. He stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the brutal afternoon sun. As he stepped inside, the light caught the left side of his face, illuminating a latticework of old scars that pulled one eye into a permanent, grim squint. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a weight that seemed to draw the very sound from the air. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to still. Blackwood's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Come to join the festivities, Elias?" The man, Elias, said nothing. His gaze swept over the leering faces, cold and dismissive, before it landed on the platform. He looked at Alara, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes held not the predatory hunger of the others, but something ancient and hollow, a sorrow so deep it was frightening. Then it was gone, replaced by an unreadable granite stoicism. He looked at Finn, at the boy's white-knuckled grip on his sister's hand, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. Blackwood, regaining his composure, resumed the auction. "The bid stands at $100 for the pair, a bargain for a lifetime of service." A grimy prospector with a yellowed beard raised a finger. 110. 120, shouted another. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, praying for an end that wasn't this. The bidding escalated, a verbal dogfight over two broken children. When the price reached $200, a sum that could buy a small herd of cattle, Blackwood raised his cane. $200, going once, going twice. Elias moved. He didn't shout a higher bid. He simply walked toward the platform, his heavy boots echoing in the sudden, tense quiet. He stopped before Blackwood, and from a worn leather satchel, he withdrew a canvas bag. He didn't toss it. He placed it on the stage with a deafening thud that spoke of solid, undeniable weight. Gold. The sound of it silenced every man in the room. 500, Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It wasn't a bid. It was a final statement. Blackwood's eyes widened, his greed warring with his surprise. He greedily eyed the bag. "That's a generous offer, Elias." "It's not an offer," Elias stated, his scarred face a mask of grim finality. He looked past Blackwood, his gaze locking with Alara's. "They are mine." No one dared to counter. No one dared to breathe. The prospector who had bid 110 sank back into his chair, suddenly finding the floor intensely interesting. The power in the room had shifted entirely, drawn into the orbit of the silent, scarred man. He had silenced them all not with a threat, but with the sheer, crushing weight of his will. He stepped onto the platform and extended a hand, not to Alara, but to Finn. The boy flinched, hiding behind his sister. Elias waited, his hand steady, calloused, and unthreatening. After a long moment, he simply lowered it. He turned and walked away, expecting them to follow. Alara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, took Finn's hand and stepped off the platform, leaving her childhood behind in the dust. The journey to his homestead was a silent ordeal across a vast, unforgiving landscape. The wind swept across the plains, a mournful cry that seemed to claw at the wagon. Elias drove the team with an economy of motion, his focus fixed on the horizon. He never looked back at them, huddled under a rough wool blanket in the wagon bed. To Alara he was an enigma, a monster who had bought her. She saw the scars, the cold silence, the immense, contained power, and her fear was a living thing. She held Finn, whispering reassurances she didn't feel, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. What kind of man paid $500 for 2 stray children? What service could possibly be worth so much? The sun was bleeding its last light across the bruised purple sky when they arrived. The homestead was as stark and isolated as the man himself. A small, sturdy cabin, a solid barn, and a web of fences stood as a lonely testament to human endurance against the vast, empty wilderness. A lone cottonwood tree stood guard, its bare branches clawing at the twilight. It was a place of profound loneliness. Inside, a fire was already laid in the stone hearth. Elias gestured toward a small room off the main one. "You'll stay here." Inside were 2 simple cots with clean, patched quilts. On one, a bowl of water and a clean rag were laid out. Alara watched him, waiting for the command, the demand, the cruelty she knew was coming. But he simply turned and began preparing a meal. The smell of stew filled the small cabin, a scent so warm and comforting it felt like a trick. He ladled it into 2 bowls and set them on the small wooden table, along with a loaf of dark bread. He ate his own portion standing by the fire, his back to them. He never spoke a word. He was their jailer, their owner, but he made no demands. Days bled into a silent routine. Elias would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and deliberate. He would chop wood, tend to his few cattle, and mend fences against the coming winter. He left food for them on the table, always enough, always warm. He never forced them to work, never addressed them directly. His silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable, yet it was not a menacing silence. It was heavy with something else, something she couldn't name. She began to watch him, studying him from the small window of their room. She saw the way he'd pause while mending a fence, his gaze drifting to a small hillock behind the cabin where 2 simple wooden crosses stood against the sky. He would stand there for long minutes, a statue of grief, before the cold wind would finally seem to rouse him. The scars on his face seemed to deepen in those moments, a roadmap of a pain she was beginning to recognize. One morning, she saw him by the barn, patiently working a leather strap through the broken buckle of Finn's small, worn shoe. He worked with a focused tenderness, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He left the mended shoe just outside their door, a silent offering. Finn saw it first, and his eyes, usually wide with a constant, simmering fear, softened for a moment. He slipped the shoe on and it fit perfectly. Alara felt a crack form in the wall of her fear. A man who mended a child's shoe wasn't a monster. He was something else, something more complicated and far more tragic. The catalyst was a small, carved bird. Finn had taken to whittling, a sliver of wood and a small, dull knife Elias had left on the porch becoming his only solace. He worked for days on a piece of cottonwood, his small hands slowly coaxing the shape of a meadowlark from the grain. One afternoon, as Elias was returning from the fields, his face grim with exhaustion, Finn walked right up to him. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The boy stopped before the giant, scarred man and held out the small wooden bird. Elias froze. He looked down at the boy, then at the offering in his small, trembling hand. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly Elias knelt, bringing his scarred face level with the child's. He reached out and accepted the bird, his rough fingers cradling it as if it were a fragile, living thing. He looked at Finn, and the hardness in his eyes dissolved. revealing the vast, hollow grief beneath. "Thank you," he whispered, the words raspy from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken to either of them since the day he'd bought them. That evening, he led Finn to the barn, not to work, but to a stall where a young foal stood on spindly legs. He showed the boy how to hold out his hand, how to let the animal learn his scent. He spoke to Finn in that same low, quiet voice, explaining the simple, gentle language of horses. Alara watched from the doorway, the warm lantern light casting them in a soft glow. She saw not an owner and his property, but a broken man and a broken boy finding a moment of quiet connection in a world that had offered them none. She was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid for him. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the world in a pristine, suffocating silence. A blizzard descended upon the plains, a raging beast of wind and ice that trapped them inside the cabin for days. The forced proximity should have been tense, but instead, it felt like a sanctuary. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm, beating heart against the storm's fury. They existed in a quiet bubble of shared space, the silence now comfortable, punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the logs. One night, as the blizzard raged its worst, Elias sat staring into the flames, the carved bird Finn had given him turning over and over in his hands. The firelight danced across his scars. "I had a daughter," he said. His voice so quiet Alara wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to the ghosts in the fire. "Her name was Sarah. She would have been your age." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken loss. Alara felt her own grief rise to meet his, a silent communion of sorrow. "She loved meadowlarks," he added, his thumb stroking the wooden bird. "And my wife Mary. She could make anything grow." He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "They were taken by men like Blackwood. I wasn't there. I was away, chasing a debt that didn't matter." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the failure etched into his palms. These scars, they're a reminder now she understood. The isolation wasn't a choice. It was a penance. The $500 wasn't a price. It was an act of desperate, belated redemption. He hadn't bought her to own her. He had bought her to save her from the life that had claimed his own family. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He just nodded, the conversation over. But the wall between them was gone, turned to dust by a shared, acknowledged pain. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was remade, pristine and quiet under a blanket of white. A fragile peace settled over the homestead. Alara began to help with chores, not out of obligation, but out of a nascent sense of belonging. She fed the chickens, kneaded bread, and mended Elias's torn shirt, her stitches small and neat. He would watch her sometimes, a flicker of something like warmth in his desolate eyes. Finn started spending all his time in the barn with the foal, and once, Alara heard the faint, breathy sound of him whispering to the animal. The homestead was slowly, tentatively becoming a home. The peace was shattered on a cold, clear afternoon. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, dark specks against the endless white. Elias saw them first. His body went rigid, his hand instinctively going to the axe he'd been using to split wood. As they drew closer, Alara recognized the man in the lead. Silas Blackwood. Her blood ran cold. He rode up to the fence line, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. "Elias," he called out, "a man of your means, living in a hovel like this. I've come to collect on a bad investment." "You were paid," Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Paid for the goods, yes?" Blackwood sneered, his eyes sliding over to Alara, who stood frozen on the porch. "But I've been thinking. You clearly have more than you let on. I figure this land and everything on it will cover the interest." Including her, Elias took a slow step forward. "Turn your horse around, Blackwood." Right away, Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the clean air. "I don't think so. I've come for what's mine." He and his 2 men dismounted, drawing their pistols. "Go inside," Elias said to Alara, never taking his eyes off Blackwood. Take the boy. The seller. Bolt it for a second. She couldn't move. Then she saw the grim certainty in his eyes. This was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. She ran inside, grabbed a terrified Finn, and hurried them down the narrow steps into the root cellar, sliding the heavy bolt into place just as the first gunshot cracked the winter silence. The sounds from above were terrifying. The sharp report of pistols, the splintering of wood, a man's scream cut brutally short. Then, the sickening, wet thud of an axe meeting flesh, followed by a heavy fall. Alara held Finn, covering his ears, her own body shaking uncontrollably. She prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in, prayed for the scarred man who had become their unlikely protector. Then came Blackwood's voice, laced with cruel fury, shouting from just outside the cellar door. You think you can hide from me, Elias? You couldn't save your wife. You couldn't save your whelp of a daughter. You let them die, and now you'll die protecting this little stray. A profound silence followed his taunt. It stretched for an eternity. Alara knew what that silence meant. It was the silence of a man pushed past his breaking point. A guttural roar of pure, animal rage echoed from above, followed by the sounds of a brutal, desperate struggle. Furniture crashed. A body slammed against the cellar door. Alara looked at the heavy bolt, then at the face of her terrified brother. She would not be a victim again. She would not hide while someone else fought for her. Her fear transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. Pushing Finn behind her, she slid the bolt back. She crept up the stairs. The main room was a scene of carnage. 2 of Blackwood's men were dead. Elias and Blackwood were locked in a deadly grapple near the hearth. Blackwood holding a knife, Elias fighting to keep the blade from his throat. Elias was bleeding from a gash on his arm, his face a mask of primal fury, but Blackwood was younger, quicker. He was losing. Alara's eyes darted around the room, landing on the heavy iron poker resting by the fire, its tip still glowing faintly. Without a second thought, she grabbed it. It was heavy, hot. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She swung it with all the strength in her body, bringing the solid iron down on the back of Blackwood's head. He grunted, his eyes widening in shock as his grip on the knife slackened. It was the opening Elias needed. He threw Blackwood to the floor and the fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by their harsh, ragged breaths. The snow had begun to fall again, soft, fat flakes drifting down, obscuring the violence of the world outside. Elias stood over Blackwood's body, his chest heaving. He looked at Alara, at the poker still clutched in her hands, at the fierce, defiant set of her jaw. He saw not a girl, but a survivor. He stumbled back against the table, the adrenaline fading, leaving only pain. He slid to the floor, clutching his bleeding arm. Alara dropped the poker with a clatter and rushed to his side. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her touch firm and sure. The roles had reversed. She was no longer the one being tended to. She was the one giving aid. He had protected her with his strength, and she had protected him with her courage. In the doorway of the cellar, Finn stood watching. He looked at the wreckage, at his sister tending to the wounded man, at the quiet of the falling snow. He took a hesitant step into the room, then another. He walked over to where Elias and Alara were, and placed a small, steadying hand on his sister's shoulder. "Home," he whispered. The word was quiet, fragile, but it resonated through the broken room with the force of a thunderclap. Elias looked from the boy to the girl, his saviors, his unlikely family. The long winter of his soul began to thaw. Spring came to the high plains, and with it, a gentle, determined green that pushed its way through the thawing earth. The 2 wooden crosses on the hill no longer looked so lonely. Alara had planted a small garden around them, tending to the new shoots of columbine and wild mint. It was a place of memory, but now it was also a place of life. Elias, his arm healed but newly scarred, was teaching Finn how to ride the foal, now a sturdy colt. The boy's laughter, a sound Alara had thought she'd never hear again, echoed across the ranch. They rarely spoke of the past. There was no need. It lived in Elias's scars, in the resilience in Alara's eyes, and in the newfound voice of a boy who had been silent for too long. Their words were few, but their silences were filled with a deep, abiding understanding. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, the three of them sat on the porch. Elias was carving a new bird for Finn, a hawk this time, its wings outstretched. Alara was mending a blanket, her needle moving in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Finn leaned against Elias's leg, tracing the patterns on the worn leather of his boots. No contracts had been signed, no vows exchanged. But looking out at the vast, quiet land that had once been a prison and was now a sanctuary, they knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that they were a family. They had been forged in the fire of a cruel world, and together, they had found their way home.